Hello and welcome again to the Writer Review. This is Eric Cartwright, and this week we're going to be taking a look back at the 1987 horror fantasy comedy titled The Witches of Eastwick. Now, The Witches of Eastwick runs for 1 hour and 58 minutes long. It is directed by George Miller. It is produced by Neil Canton, Peter Goober, and John Peters. The script was written by Michael Christopher. Okay, let's see. It is actually based on the novel The Witches of Eastwick by John Updike. The score was done by John Williams, the cinematography by Vilmos Zsigmond, and it was edited by Hubert de Boudiary and Richard Francis Bruce. And the stars of the movie are Jack Nicholson. We also have Cher. We have Susan Sarandon. We have Michelle Pfeiffer. We have Veronica Cartwright. We have Richard Jenkins. We also have Keith Jochim, Becca Lish, and Carel Struyken. Now, for all those who don't know who Carel Struyken is, Struyken was actually, he was noted for playing the role of Lurch in the Addams Family movies that were made in the 90s. Yeah, he's in there. He's going to play the role just like Lurch from the Addams Family and its sequel, Addams Family Values. He plays the part of a butler who goes by the name of Fidel. And just like Lurch, he's not really rendered to saying very much. Well, in the Addams Family incarnate, he doesn't say anything at all, but just some mere... But here, he's really limited in terms of dialogue, so he is definitely not really entitled to doing any speaking parts, but he does play the role as Daryl's loyal butler. When it was first released in 1987, I felt then, and still to this day, that The Witches of Eastwick is just one of those timeless classics that you can go back upon and watch every so often, and you can find newer discoveries through every viewing. Even though there is always something about this film that I could truly smile upon, it's still the farthest distance from being anything but a definitive, groundbreaking masterpiece. It's not perfect, but it does live up to my expectations. And I think there's a really lot to enjoy about. I, for one, actually had a ball watching this movie. It's fun. It's exciting. It's got a whole myriad filled of genres that might appease to any fan. If you like comedy, there's plenty of comedy in there. If you like fantasy, there are a lot of fantasy elements. If you like horror, there is plenty of horror there too, but it's not over the top in terms of horror, but there are some very horrific scenes if you could stomach that type of stuff that is delivered in this movie. It's got a lot going for it, and I think it will please a lot of people. The weak point into this classic witch fantasy movie is that the script could have been at times a bit too saccharine and sugary, even to be regarded as a horror film. There's no massive body count, so it's not one of those stupid slasher movies where everybody just dies and then the main antagonist meets his or her fate in the end. No, it's not like that at all. I mean, there is maybe only two death scenes, and that's, Veronica Cartwright's character, Felicia, she dies, and of course, the main villain, Daryl, meets his fate. Sometimes I think that this horror film, or the horror elements in this film, can at times be misleading, and in some cases, it can be a bit manipulative. And even though it was really never meant to be taken seriously, the story really has no point to it as well. I mean, what is the message being delivered in this movie? I mean, wasn't it the mission for Alex, Jane, and Suki to find the right man? After all, they seem to have come to a point where they're stuck in a rut in their lives. They're all widowed. Two are divorced. One's husband's dead. Wasn't their mission supposed to be looking for the Mr. Right that they want, only in the end to discover that they don't need anybody, and that they're just happy being together as one big extended family? So I don't see where there is any points or morals to the story. Does it have to be like anything serious? Not exactly, but at least they should have had some kind of point to this movie. There's a lot of material that could have been covered to its fullest potential, but there was little going for it. That it felt way too lowered down, like it was aiming for a younger audience. But unfortunately, the light stuff that's in this movie is completely bogged by a cornucopia of profanity and sexual innuendos that makes this film way too dark for younger viewers. So although it looks like the aim and the target was for a younger audience, but what's taken aback from the younger people from seeing this movie is that this movie is just saturated with a lot of jokes about private parts. There's a lot of dick jokes. There's a lot of ass jokes, pussy, tits, you name it. It's all in the 20-piece bucket. I know I should not be using these kind of words, but unfortunately, the truth has to come out. I would not recommend a younger audience to see this movie for the sake of all these sexual innuendos. And it's not just coming from the mouths of Daryl, but it seems like the other three ladies are also going in on telling jokes about private parts. Making funny out of someone's dick. These jokes like this is basically what is the turnoff as to why a younger audience member shouldn't see this. I mean, I think that when I think about this movie is that I sometimes also think of it as almost like a seedling to the TV series Charmed. But the difference between the TV series Charmed is that although it has a dark atmosphere and it is full of witches trying to take down vampires, demons, and any other sources of evil with the use of their magic and sorcery, at least in Charmed, you could actually let a younger audience member see this series, because Charmed was 8 seasons, and the content was a lot more lighthearted, especially when it came to dialogue. In the Charmed series that came out in the 90s and into the 2000s, there was very little in terms of sexual innuendos. But here, the characters, be it protagonists or antagonists, they all seem to sort of have this strange, perverted dialogue that takes them with them throughout. It's just practically omnipresent, and it can be a bit distracting. For a film in which the leading villain is the devil himself, you would expect to have a much more gritty, darker, sinister edge towards him. And the leading protagonists are witches, so you would expect more hexes and spells played out to a more darker theme instead of less playful. I mean, when the witches were trying to bring down the devil himself, their tactics seem more dependent on being more jovial instead of, taking this guy down in a much more serious format. And if you're into like more darker horror themes, then maybe this movie may not necessarily appease to the die-hard horror fans. But under all the ranting that I've done, I do go back and watch this film because it does cure me for when I'm depressed. And it's not like I'm depressed all the time, but every once in a while, sometimes life treats me very badly. I mean, I'm sure it has that effect on everybody else. So I probably might be speaking out not just for myself, but to a lot of people. But whenever I'm sad and blue, then this movie will surely do. And, because this movie does have this way of lifting your spirits. Because it's light, it's funny, it's humorous, yes, it's vulgar, yes, there's a lot of sexual innuendo, and yes, if you're a die-hard horror fan who likes his horror dark and gritty, well, this may not be for you, but there is still a lot to like about this movie that really is special. And I think it actually helps a lot that the leading performers are all very, very extremely talented. If it wasn't for the star quality provided here, like Jack Nicholson, Cher, Susan Sarandon, and Michelle Pfeiffer, this movie would have totally been forgotten to the point of B-film obscurity or made for video without really little to no recognition. The performers are definitely the bread and butter that makes this film stand out. And it's these stars that give it their all, even if the material given to them is quite limited. The performers take their characters and each and every one of them add a dimension to hold things together, to convey a light charm, and to hold your interest each time they light up the screen. Whether the casting director was in charge, I hope he or she gets a little more commission for casting a great ensemble of talented performers, because it's stars like these that turned this pile of straw into gold. Nice touch of genius to the cast, especially Smiling Jack as your average horny little devil, like he says. I mean, there are a lot of great memorable scenes. There's a lot of great, and I'm going to sort of go over a little bit about the characters, because this movie is truly a character-driven film. So let's start off with the star of the show here, Mr. Jack Nicholson. Well, I am actually quite glad that he actually took the role of Daryl Van Horn, because it was originally intended for Bill Murray to be in it. But if it was Bill Murray, this movie probably would have been more with an emphasis on comedy than it is for a more darker horror film. But I'm just glad that Jack took this role, because he just fits in. I mean, he's got that sharky smile that actually has a bit of a devil in him. I mean, those piercing eyebrows of his, those angry eyebrows and that sinister smile, you can't get more devilish than that. And Jack Nicholson, he just ate up every scene that he was in. Daryl Van Horn, he lives next door to well, he moved into an old abandoned house called the Lennox House, which has been abandoned because of many urban legends that the house is cursed and that if anybody who moves into that house, bad things will happen. So yeah, Jack Nicholson, he chews up every scene he's in. I especially love is even though his humor is sick, he lets his sick humor go on with a smile. It's that piercing smile that really personifies everything that's evil. I mean, the guy definitely wants to use. The guy is a charming individual. He's smart. He's manipulative, very, very manipulative. And he uses the three leading witches, their vulnerabilities, their weaknesses to his advantage. Only to realize that, of course, as always, like in every fantasy fairy tale type story, the bad guys will always get their comeuppance. And even though he can manipulate them for a long time, in the end, he will come up short. Cher plays the role of Alex Medford. I think that was her name, or Alexandra. She's a widowed woman. She's a sculptor. Her husband is dead. And I guess she just wants another man in her life so she could try and at least withdraw from her grief. She has a child, a teenage daughter, but she's not in a lot of scenes. But it takes her a while to get a liking to Daryl. Who could forget that scene where they had lunch together, and she starts evaluating about his shortcomings, being that she takes a real disinterest and a dislike into him. But then for some reason she insults him. She says that he is morally reprehensible, intellectually retarded, he's vulgar, he's stupid, and he smells. But he just lets these insults just like shoo away like flies. But what they eventually end up getting it on. And he's not the only person who he has used his power of seduction. He's also had Susan Sarandon's character. Her name is Jane Spafford. She is a music teacher, and she's also a musician herself. She plays the cello. And one day, Daryl, of course, seems to be somewhat of a music aficionado himself. And he starts teaching Jane some finer strategies of playing the cello, or even playing difficult pieces. And then she also eventually seems to be somewhat lured into his creativity. And who can ever forget the scenes in the classroom where she decides to say, never mind what's written on the script, just let your inner chops get to you, tickle, tickle, diddle, diddle, And she starts throwing the musical booklets across. She kicks off her shoes, and she starts, letting it loose. And of course, that scares off the school principal, who runs off. I believe his name was Walter, played by Keith Jochim. Yeah, that guy was bad news. He obviously has the hots for Jane, but I think after that scene, he lays low on her eventually. Jane is obviously unlike Alex, who's kind of like has a more feminist approach. Jane seems a bit kind of more desperate. Her too is a widow. Her husband divorced her because she just couldn't produce kids. I don't know what the story was behind the whole lack of having kids. Was it because she was sterile or he didn't have enough sperm in his bank? Your guess is as good as mine, but I'm beginning to think maybe it was her ex-husband, because even though she was never able to have a child with him, she eventually ends up having a child with Daryl. Come to think of it, even Cher herself ends up getting pregnant. I mean, Alex, she ends up getting it too. And then we move over to Suki Ridgman, played by Michelle Pfeiffer. She really, really might be the weakest of the three witches. I think her character is a little less developed. She too is also a widow. Her husband divorced her because she just couldn't keep her fucking legs closed. Excuse my language. I mean, yeah, she has like children left, right, and center. And I guess he just couldn't keep up with the commitments. So he said, fuck you, you're on your own. Yeah, in movies that it seems like kind of strange that in every movie that actually has mostly female cast members, male characters seem to come across as either one of two things: complete assholes or submissive henpicks. Yeah, she seems to be somewhat tempted by her sensitivity towards life itself, and it seems like Daryl seems to be somewhat attracted towards her sensitivity. I mean, who can forget the scenes where they took place at the swimming pool, and he was trying to ask her and question them about their weaknesses. Alex has a fear of snakes. Susan Sarandon, I don't remember what her fear was. I think it had something to do with aging. I'm not sure. I don't remember. And Suki, she has a fear, not necessarily of death, but her weakness is that she's not afraid of death. She just hates the pain that comes before death. It's like, why is it that when a person is dying, there's a lot of physical pain? Yeah, those are just some pretty memorable, messed up shit that happens in these scenes. And eventually, all of their nightmares and all of their fears, once they start to ditch Daryl for a while, Daryl, of course, obviously becomes pissed off, so he takes their vulnerabilities and uses it to their advantage. Alex wakes up to a bed of snakes. Suki is almost lying dead in the hospital, is dying in the hospital, and it takes a while for her to recover, but somehow he kind of like has this kind of magic spell to sort of revive her again. Yeah. And then the next character I want to talk about, she doesn't really get very much recognition from this movie, but she is really, really effective. And she is the one that I actually seem to be the most invested in. I'm talking about Felicia Alden, played by Veronica Cartwright. Is she not the queen of Scream? Because if she is not, I don't know who is. I remember her from an older movie, which was the remake of The Invasion of the Body Snatchers. She is also once again caught in a perilous situation where it seems that the whole city of San Francisco is on some kind of zombie-like epidemic, and she's constantly on the run. Here, once again, we find her in another horror situation where she is once again the misfortunate victim of circumstance. It seems that she has been an easy prey to this predator that is Daryl. I mean, you can forget the scenes where she was in church and she fell down the stairs and broke her leg. And then all of a sudden she goes from being this tight-knit conservative to this outraged, almost like a bit of a lunatic. I mean, I hate to say that to her about her, but yes, her paranoia goes from bad to worse, and she doesn't progress. I mean, you can't forget the scenes where they were talking with Daryl about Felicia. You know, as soon as Alex, Jane, and Suki start being in connection with Daryl, the people in their town of Eastwick, which is really tight-knit and conservative. I gotta admit, the town they live in is so spectacular. I mean, it's like almost like a postcard come to life. But still, while she is like in her house with her husband, who works for the local community paper in Eastwick, which is also where Suki works. Hey, what do you know? She's a columnist for a small town community newspaper. In other words, Suki and I, we're from the same cloth. We're both community journalists. Anyhow, enough about that. Enough of that. Yes. Her husband, his name is Clyde, played by Richard Jenkins. And yes, this is Richard Jenkins with hair. All kidding aside. Yes, she's really, really, really sadly has lost it, and her sanity just keeps going from bad to worse. So while at the Lennox house in the swimming pool, Daryl has this big bowl of cherries. And every time they're talking, he kind of dismisses the things that what Alex, Jane, and Suki are saying, or tries to console with them. And he ends up just constantly saying to them, have a cherry. Have another cherry. Every time. Every time they finish a sentence, Daryl would say, have a cherry. And the more time they eat the cherries and they spit out the pits, Felicia just gets getting madder and madder. And then she ends up throwing up. Oh yes, I also forgot to mention, there's a lot of vomit that happens in this movie. I don't know if director George Miller has some kind of a vomit fetish, but yeah, there are a lot of scenes that are disgusting. Hell, during the climax where Daryl leaves to go buy some food for the three girls. What did they want? It bagels and ice cream. So he goes to the nearby stores to buy them some food. Like, while this is happening, they're playing mind games. I mean, they're really, really fucking up his mind. And yes, he does a lot of throwing up too. They eat the cherries, they spit out the pits, and he starts vomiting. A lot of gross humor in this movie. Kids, wait till you're 18. That's all I got to say. Richard Jenkins is also quite effective in his role. He's not given a lot of time. He doesn't give him a lot of dialogue. But, you do have to take some pity for him. I mean, it was unfortunate that he ended up firing Suki. But at the same time, he is also trying to come to terms with his very sick wife, who seems to be somewhat possessed by the devil himself. And it came up to a no point where he had to take a branding iron and stabbed her because her animal primal instincts was coming. There was even parts where she was getting so mad that she was actually growling, almost like a wolf. I guess out of fear, he had no choice but to put her down. And it came to a point where he ended up getting arrested. I don't know if the Eastwick Chronicles was still running, even though I don't think Suki was employed with them, because obviously in this conservative town where they live, they really can't be seen too much in the public spectrum. I mean, who could forget the scene where Jane was in the shopping center and she was making a pig out of herself, eating pickled straight from the jar without paying. And then when she comes up to the cash, one of the shoppers looked at her and called her a slut in a sly, somewhat indistinctive way, but she overheard them. So, yeah, there are a lot of memorable scenes here. Many might think that the casting of the four main stars could be problematic because very so often two might get more screen time and the rest are rendered to just petty, small supporting roles with little significance to the story. However, in The Witches of Eastwick, that's not the case. The four main stars get plenty of chances to shine, and we are invested in all the characters and the situations they are facing. No need to pick sides here because they're all unique and all have amazing stories behind their characters, like what I've just mentioned. For those wondering, was it beneficial that the three witches had to be eye candy gorgeous? Well, it kind of defies the stereotype that all witches are necessarily evil with long noses, warts on their noses, and have green skin. No. In fact, having witches as gorgeous as Alex, Jane, and Suki actually works. It breaks away from the stereotypes. I think one of the things about this horror film that kind of breaks away from the stereotypes is why does it always have to take place in dark areas or dark situations? And why does the sky always have to be dark and rainy? That's kind of like a thing about cliched movies, horror themed movies. They all seem to have this kind of image that everything has to be dark. At least here, the scenery is quite immaculate. The community seems to be clean. The grass is always green. Everybody all looks prim and prop. It seems to be somewhat of a tight-knit town. Yes, people might say it's too Republican, too conservative looking. But, the scenery is just so photographic. It's like a postcard come to life. And about the whole idea of eye candy actresses playing three witches, will it work to an advantage? Of course it does. Not trying to be sexist here, but it just wouldn't work to see the manipulative devil do his evil if he wasn't hitting upon three witches that weren't attractive. And I think it works that these girls are beautiful. Because it would be hard to pinpoint who would be the less of four evils. Just by making them beautiful, at least we know who are the antagonists and who are the protagonists. It also carries the film that the three witches have a strong bonding with each other, even though, sure, they argue with each other while trying to win the heart over one man. Sure, it pays that their talent is rich, but the chemistry they have towards each other is absolutely priceless. I think there's a lot of great chemistry within each of the four characters. And yeah, even Veronica, Cartwright, and Richard Jenkins have some great on-screen time together. These three really can connect well, almost like they were sisters. And who says that sisters don't argue? They do. So what makes them not? Why should they be any different? Sisters argue and fight all the time. But because they love each other, they try to work things out. Sometimes when it comes to a point where they have to put their differences aside, they have a strong bond that holds them together, and they were able to manage to conquer Daryl that way. Another shout would go out to definitely George Miller for keeping his characters entertaining, thanks to the wonderful dialogue. Even though the story isn't really worth mentioning, Mr. Miller does succeed in making everything all the more enjoyable. Sure, the horror genre can be at times misleading, so if you prefer more light, pristine, atmospheric films with a more fantasy level going for it, then this movie is for you. If you wish to prefer more darker, gothic-themed horror stuff, then maybe this one may not be for you. Sure, it was an Oscar caliber or it'll change your life forever, even though I think it did get some Oscar nods, but not in terms of the acting department or directing, more on the technical levels. I think John Williams, who's a great legendary composer, got a nomination. I think the sound technicians too also got some nods, but that's pretty much it. But the film is definitely exciting, and it had a lot of laughs, and the performers, lead and supporting, seemed to have fun in their respective roles. This kind of fun is absent in most of today's roles. These are the kind of films that Steven Spielberg used to make before turning to more serious, lighthearted, to more serious, darker stuff, like Schindler's List, amongst others. To further dive deeper into the awkwardness of the story, which may seem like nitpicking, but it feels like a lot of stuff was edited out which could have made a little more sense. And many scenes just tend to jump in randomly, and there are times when characters just seem to look different through each scene, making everything at times a little bit incoherent. But there's much to celebrate about this film in terms of performances, characters, and dialogue, and Miller's smooth direction. The foundation that truly holds this film together was the brilliant score by the legendary John Williams. So if you can get past the negatives, I recommend this movie mostly for entertainment stuff, if nothing else. It's not going to change your life forever. You're not going to learn anything out of this. This movie is clearly meant, I'm not going to say guilty pleasure, because I don't think it's meant to be a guilty pleasure themed movie. Because when I think of a guilty pleasure thing, I would just say I would just love the movie for all the wrong reasons. No, there's a lot to like about this movie. It's beyond a guilty pleasure. It's actually a movie that you can enjoy it. You can catch new things as you go along through every viewing. And you can even probably spot some stuff that you've never seen before. I just wish some things were a little more ironed out a bit, but it's not going to deter this movie in any way, shape, or form. So, when all's said and done, I would give this movie, The Witches of Eastwick, a 7 out of 10. I still highly recommend you guys to go and see it. It's not perfect, not life-changing, but it is still effective. Its storytelling, direction, and the performers really give it their all. So I guess this ends my writer review. Thank you all for listening in. If you wish to subscribe to my channel, please feel free to do so. If you wish to leave a comment, go right ahead. But just remember the 3 simple rules. Be kind, be courteous, and please refrain from any rude comments. And I will be back again with another movie review. So until next time, this is Eric Cartwright saying, keep watching those movies, and I'll see you around. Goodbye.